what's up everyone? As we start the video, I wanted to show you exactly which colors I was using in the regular and the acrylic gouache, so that if you want to use the same colors, you'll know which colors I was using. And these are the brushes that I'm using, just very rounded, soft bristle brushes. One is a number 2, and they are both by Filbert. So I want to show you first how the acrylic gouache cannot be reactivated by water, unlike the regular gouache, which you'll see here. After it's dry, it can be reactivated by water, just like watercolor. Okay, so I'm going to paint a few little squares for you here, and first I just want to show you how you can add more water to the acrylic and the regular gouache, just to get kind of a watery effect, sort of similar to watercolor. The regular gouache tends to be used more like watercolors than the acrylic gouache, but I wanted to show you kind of side by side what you can do when you just want to add more water to the paints. And I am painting this on watercolor paper, so the regular gouache tends to glide over the paper a bit more easily because this paper is made to hold a lot of water. So the acrylic gouache tended to be a little bit more dry when I was painting it. But with this second row, I'm going to actually add white so that you can also see just the very opaque and kind of chalkiness of both sets of gouache. So I'm doing the regular gouache here first, and I just want to show you kind of how you can also lighten this gouache just by adding white. And that is called increasing the tint. So the tint of the color is referring to when you add white to the color. So either effect is great. You can have sort of this watery watercolor effect that you see on the top, or you can have a more opaque and kind of like solid looking effect, but either way will get you a lighter color. So just to show you how the regular gouache can be reactivated by water, and also the dried gouache can also mix colors. So I'm just adding some yellow on top of the blue to kind of show you how when you have a lot of water, you are going to reactivate that dry layer underneath, and it's going to mix, and of course yellow and blue give you a green color. So that's what you're seeing here as I'm adding some yellow over the irregular gouache with lots of water and kind of stirring up that dry layer underneath. Now with the acrylic gouache, I can just add yellow right on top, and it's going to act more like acrylic paint. It's not going to reactivate the layer underneath, and that way you can kind of cover up mistakes as you're making them, which is one of the great things about acrylic gouache. And you can do the same thing with regular gouache, but you do have to be careful about not using too much water if you are going to paint layers with the irregular gouache. So here I'm just going to fill in this background first with the acrylic gouache and just give this a nice kind of light pink background for Valentine's Day. And like I said, the acrylic gouache kind of did it felt a lot drier when I was trying to kind of add it to the background, and I had to keep getting more paint on my brush. And one way to avoid this is to use kind of canvas paper that's already been pre-gessoed, or if you are using watercolor paper, because it's a nice thick paper, you can prime your paper first with gesso, and then that will help your acrylic gouache or even acrylic paints glide on a lot more easily and smoothly. So next I'm just adding the regular gouache. Sorry, it took a second for me to kind of mix up this paint because I didn't have the exact same color in the regular gouache as I had in the acrylic, but I am using a lot more water with the regular gouache, so it is kind of filling in the page a lot more smoothly. But I want you to notice this space right here where the light colors do tend to dry a lot darker and darker colors do dry a bit lighter. So I want you to notice that as I'm filling in the rest of this regular gouache background, and I am just going to kind of go back over this area with some water to get the whole thing even, because like I mentioned, you can reactivate the regular gouache with water, so it's no problem. You can just reactivate it and kind of blend it in. So now I'm going to let that dry, and I'll go back over to the acrylic gouache and kind of fill in across the page this kind of lighter yellow color, and then I'll come in with a darker yellow and kind of make sure that it is balanced across the page. And if you were painting with something like watercolor, the graphite on the sketch would show through really kind of poorly. And if I was worried about the graphite showing too much, I may have kind of gone back and erased my sketch a little bit so that it was a lot lighter on the page. However, I'm going to come back with a blue outline and kind of go back over these lines, so the graphite isn't really bothering me too much. And of course, with the acrylic gouache, I can go back over in more layers, and I can do the same thing with regular gouache, but I wouldn't be able to have such a watery effect if I wanted to really cover up that graphite without kind of going back over with a darker color. As you can see, the B mine on the regular gouache is still kind of showing through, and some of the graphite lines are still kind of showing through, but that's okay because, like I mentioned, I'm going to go back with a darker color and kind of trace over that. So unlike watercolor, you can also paint with white gouache, and a lot of times artists will use white gouache with watercolor. That's another way that you can kind of mix some of these paints. So now I'm going to go back to the acrylic gouache and start writing with some darker blue, and I mixed this blue with a little bit of black to kind of make it more navy, but I don't know, it might be looking a little bit too dark, so I might go back and redo this in just a minute, but let's just see how it's looking first. So I'm finding it a little bit difficult to write with the paint, but it kind of gives it this fun, like hand-drawn look. But another thing you could do if you really wanted your font to look a little bit more clean is that you could scan this in as is and then just place a font over it, or you could use like a black pen or black ink and write it, and then scan that in and just place it on top of your hearts. Now the great thing about the acrylic gouache is I'm able to kind of go back in and clean up some of these lines and just add layers, and as mentioned earlier, it's not going to reactivate with water or anything underneath, and I really didn't like the way I wrote that, so I'm just going to cover it up completely, let that dry, and come back and rewrite it. So yeah, that's the great thing about acrylic gouache, is that if you make mistakes, it's really not the end of the world. You can come back and just add more layers and fix it up. So now I'm going to let that dry while I do the regular gouache side, and I do have to be a little bit more careful on this side. It is easier to kind of layer on a darker color on lighter colors, so this is going to work out just fine, I believe, but I just have to be careful not to get too much water on my brush so that I'm not kind of mixing this blue with the color underneath. Both paints tend to look quite chalky and kind of opaque, whereas watercolor tends to be a lot more translucent, as does acrylic paint. But I would say between the two, the acrylic gouache does tend to look a lot flatter, almost like a vector drawing, whereas the regular gouache, you can really go either way. Like, you can get it to have a super flat look, kind of like I did with the hearts, but you can also get a lot more variation and kind of luminosity with adding more water, kind of like I did on the background. If you notice, the background is a lot more translucent than on the regular gouache side than on the acrylic gouache, which is more matte. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video if you got something out of it. And make sure to watch my next video as well to kind of see what I end up doing with these hearts and how I kind of format them into a pattern for a homemade Valentine's Day card. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.